So far, we've learned how to talk about events in the past and in the present, but how do we talk about things that happen in the future? Talking about the future in Greek is done using the future tense, and the future tense, fortunately, has very simple forms. We just have to take a sigma tense marker and insert it after the verb stem before the present tense endings. Now, this is very consistent and very regular. The only hazard is that we can confuse it with the first aorist forms because the tense marker, the sigma, is the same as the first aorist. So how do we distinguish the future from the first aorist? Well, first of all, the future forms have no augment. Why? Because the augment marks past time. And obviously we're dealing with future time here. The other way we can tell them apart is that the future tense uses the same endings after the sigma as the present tense verbs do. So let's see an example of the forms that these patterns produce. The endings that we're going to use are again the same as the present tense, and so it's good to remind ourselves of the primary active endings here, which are the same ones we used in the present tense. And you'll notice, for example, that in the first person singular, the primary active ending is nothing, and that the O of the first person singular was formed from a lengthening of the omicron connecting vowel. But the rest of these should be quite familiar to you. If we take our example verb luo, then the first person singular would be luso. The verb stem lu plus the sigma marker of the future plus o, which is the present tense first person singular ending. Similarly, luces, luce is the third person singular, and then in the plural, lusamen, lucetta, and lususe, or lususin, depending on whether that movable nu is put on the end. In the middle voice, we'll have the same primary middle passive endings that we used for middle and passive present tense verbs. So these, again, in their raw form are my, psi, tai, metha, estha, and entai, just like we've seen before. Moving on to the middle voice, we find really no difference from the pattern we saw in the active voice. With future verbs, we simply put the sigma between the lu stem of the verb and the present middle verb endings. So the first person singular middle voice is lusamai. Then we have luce, lucetai, lusamatha, lucestha, and lusantai. Easy. But what does the future tense mean, and how do we use it? Well, the meaning of the future tense, fortunately, is just like the English future tense. There are no special nuances here like we had in the present and the aorist. There's no particular aspect associated with the future tense. And this is the only way to signal future time in Greek. So we don't have to distinguish between different future tenses and different implications of those different tenses. Translating the future tense is usually as simple as using the helper words will or going to, just like in English. So lusamen could be translated we will loose or we are going to destroy, depending on how we take the sense of luo there. We should just note with deponent verbs, and these are verbs that sound active but take a middle form even though they sound like the action is active. And really, these are actions that are middle in nature. A verb that is deponent like this in the present tense may not be deponent in the future, and vice versa. So you need to either remember the future form separately from the present tense form, or if you can't remember it, find it in a lexicon, look it up, and look at the future form. And if it's a middle form that they give for the future, then it's most likely a deponent verb in the future. And that will avoid a lot of confusion where you're trying to figure out why this would be passive. Now, since we're adding a sigma tense marker onto the end of the stem for the future tense, we're going to run into the same kind of combinations of stops and sigma that we saw with the first aorist. So here again is our square of stops, the labial stops, p, beta, and phi, the velar stops, kappa, gamma, and chi, and the dental stops, tau, delta, and theta. And we need to just remember here that the labial stops, any of them plus sigma, gives us a psi. The velar stop, when it runs into the sigma tense marker, gives us xi. And a dental stop, when it runs into the sigma tense marker, gives us just a sigma. They disappear. We should also remember that zeta and sigma at the end of a tense, or at the end of a verb stem, act the same way a dental stop does. So sigma plus sigma will just be sigma, and zeta plus sigma will also just be sigma. Here are some examples of how this looks in the future tense. If we take baptizo and the baptides stem, add the sigma tense marker now for the future, and the present tense ending omega, then instead of baptides so, we just have baptizo, I will baptize. Why? Because a dental stop, or a sigma, or a zeta, plus the sigma tense marker just leaves us with a sigma alone. Ago, if we try to put that in the future tense, we have ag, the stem, ending in that gamma, which is a velar stop, gamma plus the sigma tense marker plus the omega first person singular ending. And instead of agso, we have axo, I will lift. Why? I will lead. Why? Because the velar stop, gamma, plus the sigma tense marker collapse to become, or combine to become, a xi. Finally, blepo. We have the blep stem of the verb, which ends in the labial stop, p. When we add on the sigma tense marker for the future and the omega first person singular personal ending, we end up with blepso, I will see. Why? Because the labial stop, p, has combined with the sigma tense marker to make a psi. We also need to remember here our vowel lengthening patterns. Remember that with contract verbs, the short vowel that comes before a sigma tense marker often lengthens. So epsilon will lengthen to eta. Alpha will lengthen to eta as well, and omicron will lengthen to omega. So here are some examples of future tenses that involve that lengthening. If we take the verb zao, I live, za is the stem ending in an alpha. We add on the sigma tense marker and the omega personal ending, and instead of zaso, we have zeso. Why? Because that short vowel, that alpha, in front of the sigma wants to lengthen to eta. Similarly, zeteo, when the epsilon of zete runs into the sigma tense marker, we end up lengthening it so that we have zeteso, I will seek. And plerao, with a short omicron vowel at the end of the stem,
That vowel will lengthen to omega, and we end up with the form pleroso, I will fill. As with the first aorist, with the future too, liquid verbs are going to be a little bit tricky. If you remember, a liquid verb is one whose stem ends in a liquid consonant. That's lambda, mu, nu, or rho. What happens is that the tense marker changes to epsilon sigma instead of just sigma. But that triggers another transformation, because that leaves the sigma of the tense marker between two vowels, which it doesn't like. So the sigma drops out, leaving just epsilon as the tense marker. Finally, the epsilon that's left behind combines with the omicron or epsilon connecting vowel. So what does this look like in practice? Well, if we take the example of meno, in the first person singular, we will initially have men plus epsilon sigma s plus o. And that tense marker has become s because of the nu, the liquid consonant at the end of the stem. The sigma drops out, so now we just have men plus epsilon plus o. And then the epsilon and omega will combine. And if you remember our combining rules from before, anything plus omega is just omega. So we end up with the form meno. I will remain. And this is one of a few cases in which we end up with the same form as the present tense. Meno, after all, is the present tense first person singular form, I remain. And the same form, meno, is used in the future first person singular, I will remain. How do we distinguish these? Well, if we're a little bit more advanced and we're looking at the accents, then we may notice a circumflex accent over the final omega there, showing that the omega has collapsed together with the epsilon, and that would be our clue that it was a future form. But it's probably good to get used to just distinguishing these ambiguous forms from context. In context, it will usually be clear whether meno is a present tense first person singular or a future tense first person singular. In most cases, though, the future of a liquid verb doesn't just look like the present tense. So let's look at the various future forms of meno. We've seen that the first person singular is just meno, I will stay. In the next row here we have the second person singular, so we have the men stem plus s plus the ace ending, and the epsilon of s is going to combine with the epsilon iota diphthong, and if you remember, any short vowel plus epsilon iota, the diphthong usually just becomes absorbed into the diphthong. So all we're left with is a. So we have the form menes, you will stay. Well, that does look like the future tense, the present tense form again. But in this next form, the second person plural, we'll find something different. So here we have the men stem plus s plus eta for the second person plural. Now the epsilon of our tense marker is going to combine with the epsilon of the eta ending, or the connecting vowel of eta. And when epsilon and epsilon meet, they become a diphthong, epsilon iota. And so they become a. That means that the second person plural future form of meno isn't going to be meneta, it's going to be meneta, and that will mean you plural will stay. With the first person plural again, we'll find that when the epsilon of the tense marker combines with the omicron connecting vowel of omen, the epsilon and omicron together make an u, omicron upsilon diphthong. So we have the form menumen, we will stay. And then in the third person Another category of verbs that we should just keep an eye on when we're forming future tense forms is verbs that take second aorist with changed stems. Why? Well, because the real root of some verbs isn't visible in the present tense, and what looks like stem change to produce the second aorist form sometimes with a few verbs is just the revealing of their real stem. In those few cases, the future form will use this real root, or real stem, that shows up in the aorist. And a good example here is ballo. Now, the verb ballo has two lambdas in the present tense, but the root of ballo, the real root, is just beta alpha lambda with a single lambda, and we see this in the aorist form eballon. So when we form the future, we don't use bal with two lambdas as the stem. We use the real stem, bal, with one lambda. And then we add on s with epsilon, because this is a liquid future. And that sigma will actually drop out in front of the omega ending, and we'll end up with the future form ballo with one lambda. I will throw. And actually, in this case, that's how we can tell that this is a future form and not a present form, because the second lambda has dropped out.
Finally, the last thing that we need to watch for with the future tense is future verbs that are borrowed from another verb. Sometimes a verb doesn't have its own future form for various historical reasons. And so it borrows the future form of another verb. And usually this is another verb that has gone out of usage. It's essentially died for whatever reason. And so its future form is more or less free to be borrowed by this other verb that lacks a future. These verbs, unfortunately, just have to be remembered. There are only 6 of them in total that are common in the New Testament, but they also tend to be used fairly frequently, and so it's reasonably easy to remember them through regular use. Maybe the 3 most common are erchomai, horao, and lego. So the future of erchomai doesn't look anything like erch. The future form is eleusomai, from a totally different verb. But it functions as the future form of erchomai. Eleusomai would mean I am coming, or I will come. Horao uses the future form opsomai, which must have come from a verb with a root that looked like op. But again, it is just used now as the future form of horao, and it just means I will see, or I am going to look. Notice this is an example of one case where horao is active and its future form, opsomai, is deponent. We have to use the middle form to get what sounds to us like an active voice. And thirdly, lego, such a common word for speech, uses the completely different future form ero. Again, these are things we just have to remember, or if we're stuck, look them up in a lexicon or dictionary.
You can learn more about the Greek future tense here in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek and in Wallace's Basics of New Testament Syntax.